Hello. Some may be aware that I have been writing a second book on the subject of grief. I hope it may become a useful resource for faith-based bereavement groups. I'm going to try and paraphrase the most recent chapter, which is entitled Grief in a Time of Isolation. This is a difficult time, this time of lockdown. It's desperately difficult in so many ways. But what a time to experience bereavement and endure life in isolation alone without a spouse. The last funeral that I conducted before lockdown was for Christine. Christine was a very committed Christian, a member of my church some years ago in Fairvale, Sheffield, St Cuthbert's, and she ran the parents and toddlers group for almost 10-20 years and did some really sterling work. And what happened was this, that she and Jeff, her husband, were enjoying their retirement and had so many plans. Then Jeff went off to visit his elderly mother, which he frequently did, maybe once a month or so, down in Surrey. On this occasion, Christine didn't go with him, she stayed at home. So Simon, their son, popped round on Sunday whilst his dad was away to see how his mum was doing. Tragically, he found her lying dead in the back garden. Her death was very sudden, there was no warning, she hadn't been ill, so it was deeply shocking. Jeff asked me to conduct the funeral, which was a great privilege. And then we met together, maybe twice after that, for coffee and catch-up and prayer. And then we were instructed to lock ourselves down. This self-isolation became important because of the virus. So a couple of months ago, Christine and Jeff were enjoying a full life, enjoying retirement, enjoying all the things that you would expect to be doing in retirement, and spending time with their little grandson. And now quite suddenly, Jeff is alone in self-isolation. That is a very tough call and a very challenging time. Her Majesty the Queen broadcast an Easter message in 2020. We're used to hearing her at Christmas, broadcasting her Christmas message. This is the first time in her 68 years that she'd broadcast an Easter message. And her Christian faith really shone through her words. She said, "We need Easter as much as ever. As dark as death can be, particularly for those suffering with grief, light and life are greater. As dark as death can be, light and life are greater." And when you are grappling with the raw reality of grief in a time of isolation, holding on to resurrection hope is hugely important. To live with that irrepressible hope that light and life are greater than darkness and death requires inner resources to draw upon. And it requires resilience of faith that is rooted and grounded in God. Don John expressed a profound truth in his poem, "No man is an island." No man is an island entire of itself. Each is a piece of the continent, a part of the main. No man is an island. It's true to say that human beings do not thrive when isolated from others, and this enforced isolation is a tough call for everyone, but perhaps it has particularly got a poignancy for those who are grieving the death of their life partner. There are huge mental health implications for this time of isolation. Our hope and prayer is that it will be over before too much time has elapsed. We are social creatures, and it is clear that this experience has brought out the best in very many who are reaching out to those around them, sometimes through social media, sometimes through a cheery smile and a wave because of social distancing, and sometimes through practical help with shopping. When we are no longer able to change our situation, we are challenged to change ourselves. And many are doing just that. They are doing their best to look after themselves and to look after each other, Even in times of coronavirus, we are finding ways of reaching beyond our own small island of isolation. And some practical strategies are proving important in this time of isolation. I first met Tony in the bereavement group that I attended after the death of my wife. The group proved to be a place of mutual support and care, and Tony was also grieving the death of his wife. And it was in that group that Tony met Sandra. Sandra was mourning the death of her husband, but a real friendship sprang up between Tony and Sandra, and that eventually deepened into love. They were both open and caring people, and it was so lovely to see how that they had found each other. They were part of a wider group of friends that became a real network of mutual care. And every one of them could see how much they loved one another and were really pleased that through the dark times of bereavement, the light was shining again for them and they were able to share the journey of life together. I didn't see a lot of the group when my ministry took me down to St Mary's, Denham, but I did keep in touch and received text and phone calls from Tony and Sandra. Then I heard that Sandra was unwell. Back pain. Back pain turned out to be rapidly advancing cancer of the spine. Her last text to me said, "These things come to try us, Ian, but I will stay positive and hopefully get through this challenge." But she didn't. She didn't get through it. It advanced very rapidly, and it wasn't long before she had died. So, Tony faced the grim reality of grief again, and he and the family asked me to conduct the funeral service. That wasn't easy. Sandra was such a people person. She was full of life, and Tony looked so crushed and desolate. Friends rallied round him, and long walks with his good friend Roy helped. Then came lockdown. Tony struggled, but established patterns of structure to ease him through each day. He told me of his efforts in the garden and of his decorating the kitchen and the hall of his home. He was keeping busy, which helped. Other things that helped were, for example, a communal initiative. He lives in a cul-de-sac, and he received an invitation to bring a chair with him to the end of the cul-de-sac, where the road widens out into a large circle. At an appointed time, he and his neighbours meet. They meet 3 times a week, and they are punctilious about social distancing, and this is proving a lifesaver for Tony. He's lived there in that cul-de-sac for 42 years, and now he's getting to know people that he had never ever known before. They know of his situation, and they are very empathetic and supportive. It's a strange and wonderful phenomenon that in these days, these trying days, people are coming closer to one another from a distance, finding ways of leaving their island of isolation and reconnecting as human beings. But the other thing that I have observed is that the jagged edges of grief that have become less barbed with the passing of time seem to have regained some of their capacity to wound. Because we now live in a kind of vacuum and routine is disrupted, there is much more opportunity of being alone with our thoughts, and those thoughts can often lead us back into the shadows. This has come to me from several people who lost their spouse maybe a number of years ago, just a few years ago, but were making progress through the process of healing. One friend said, who'd read my first book, the 3rd chapter is called Choose Life. And she said, I did choose life because that's what I know my husband would want. But now I can't choose living. She can no longer hug her grandchildren. She's no longer there for their birthdays. And although there's FaceTime and those things are wonderful, it doesn't make the problem go away. She longs to hug her grandchildren. And it just reminded me of some words of Elizabeth Jennings, who said, "Time does not heal. It makes a half-stitched scar that can be broken, and you feel grief as total as at the first hour." And that has happened to so many who were progressing through the process of healing, and now that half-stitched scar is broken again. That's the reality. And I, like many of my friends, are longing to hug my family and my friends. It's a kind of yearning. It's a kind of yearning in the midst of this so-called lockdown. And people in my age category and my degree of vulnerability can connect through Zoom and through FaceTime and other online platforms. And that's really valuable, but it's no substitute for a hug. A virtual hug just doesn't do it. Some people are very touchy-feely, and whilst others seem less so. But the reality is, of course, that we need human touch. I know many grandparents are feeling a kind of starvation, a hunger to hug their grandchildren. We humans are wired for touch, and that need for physical contact remains until the day that we die. I hadn't really thought about it before, but this enforced isolation has made me deeply aware of my own need to hug and be hugged. There was a really sad story on BBC Radio 4 this week. Hannah and John had been married for almost 43 years, but they both contracted coronavirus. Hannah improved, but John's condition worsened and he was taken into hospital. He died one day before their 43rd wedding anniversary. And Hannah spoke with deep sadness of the fact that for the last week of his life, none of the family could be with John. "Everyone was wonderful," she said. "My family, my church, the hospital, but nothing can alter the fact that we couldn't be together as he was dying. And now I am alone here and no one can give me a hug." She said it with tears. And that is no trivial matter. The need for a hug is fundamental to us human beings. Dr. Terry Cooper's psychologist and author writes, "Physical contact is a requirement of human beings. There is something healing about touch. It's not just correlated to being human, it is being human." And so at this time of lockdown, we don't know how long it will last. Still less do we know when life will return to normal. But we always need to build hope into our lives so that we can find a way through when anxiety threatens to engulf us. And this coronavirus is such a time when we need the buoyancy of a lively hope that is much more than just wishful thinking. You remember President Obama's book, The Audacity of Hope, a biographical book that he wrote a few years ago now. I remember reading it and being struck by it because he described his own journey of faith in his coming to faith in Jesus Christ. The audacity of hope. It's a good line, but we need something more than audacity in our hope for the future. And St. Paul, writing in Romans 15:13, says, "May the God of hope fill you with all joy and peace as you trust in him, so that you may overflow with hope by the power of the Holy Spirit." So that you may overflow with hope by the power of the Holy Spirit. So this is a time when we need the God of hope. We need to hope in God. We need a hope that is rooted and grounded in God, that will take us through these difficult times into the glorious light of a future that is filled with God's grace and filled with God's blessing. For the Queen was right, as dark as death can be, light and life are greater. So this time of isolation is undeniably hard, but in each moment we can overflow with hope by the power of the Holy Spirit, because hope wins in the end. God bless.